Welcome, everyone, to Indications and Warnings with Chuck Pfarrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. This is day 974 of Russia's genocidal invasion of Ukraine. Chuck and I are recording this episode of Indications and Warnings on October 24, 2024. Chuck, we're going to see if we can provide a big picture to our viewers of conditions on the battlefield in Ukraine, the status of Ukrainian operations and Russian operations stretching all the way from Kursk to Kherson. Nothing dramatic is happening, and that includes the relatively warm fall weather throughout Ukraine. I took a look at the weather and the conditions currently. We see temperatures pretty much in the 40s. Temperatures have dipped to freezing, 32 degrees a few times, but those steady autumnal rains haven't really started yet. It's cloudy or partly cloudy in Kharkiv. It's clear in Kherson and 47 degrees. It's partly clear in Luhansk, 46 degrees. And in Zaporizhia, it's partly clear and 49 degrees. In Sumy, cloudy and 42 degrees. In Kyiv, cloudy and 45 degrees. So the end of the summer campaign season into this shoulder season of the fall before the winter descends has been meteorologically quiet.
It has, and rain will be, the primary negative environmental condition that is going to affect both sides. But in a case where you've got tough environmental conditions, they will inevitably favor whatever side is on the defensive, because obviously this is not counterintuitive. Whoever is trying to move along muddy roads is going to have trouble. Now, logistics themselves will be complicated by muddy roads and rainy conditions, etc. But where it really tells is when troops themselves are trying to maneuver down those roads. You can very often disperse your ground lines of communication and supply. That means less mud is churned up on less particular roads as they can converge on your necessary resupply points. But very often terrain and your offensive objectives will require your troops to maneuver on a single avenue of approach. Generally, you don't even want to do that. But in this case, we've seen the Russians, they don't always seem to completely plan out their offensive operations. The other parameter that's going to affect coming engagements is that you can look at the contact reports, and it is glaringly obvious that Russian commanders seem to be under some sort of guidance that dictates that they attack a certain number of times every week. They just keep doing it, and it's going to make them pay. Things are going to be more difficult for them, and things are going to get harder to do for both sides.
That actually is the Soviet doctrine from World War II, requiring troops to make a specified number of attacks in a specified sector. And if they were unable to accomplish those number of attacks, they were up for more than just criticism.
Absolutely. The other thing that is, the Russian army right now is operating, with under historical conditions. There's an ethos in the Russian army. It inherits both from its imperial past under the Tsars and in World War I, and under its Soviet past in the tremendous sacrifices that it made in what it calls the Great Patriotic War in World War II. But you need only look that far back. And if you were to look back into the Napoleonic eras, it wouldn't change any of the things I'm going to say. In terms of resource management, a Russian general does not care how many people he loses. It never enters his mind. Personnel in the Russian armed forces are a commodity. They're consumable. It doesn't matter how many people you lose as long as you are carrying out your quota of attacks. And this can rise to stupefying levels. In the Battle of Berlin and in the weeks including the Soviet advance from the Silo Heights, which are to the east of Berlin, into the city of Berlin, they lost more than 1 million men prior to the battle in Berlin. 1 million men in the space of a matter of weeks. Marshal Zhukov was not relieved for that. Any American general would have been fired and possibly shot. But that is their legacy. Those are their heroes, and this is the way they operate.
And they do continue to operate that way today. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we have seen Russian casualties in September and October become pretty much the most lethal period for Russians in Ukraine in the course of this war in terms of killed and wounded. It's risen to an average of 1,200 a day, actually soared above it just a few days ago, more than 1,500 Russian casualties in a single day. It was either the most or second most lethal day of the war for Russians fighting.
Yeah, we have seen the median or mean number of Russian casualties. You and I can remember earlier in this war when it was 200, then it was 300, then it was 500. And in this last year, the median number is actually 1,000. And 1,500 recently, and I believe the highest I've ever seen is 1,700. Now that is casualties all in, killed, wounded, missing, taken prisoner. You just, and those increases in Russian casualties, they are always correlated with an increased tempo of Russian operations. And to put that very, very, put it in a very easy to understand manner, the harder they fight, the more people they lose. And that isn't what you want to have. The harder you fight, the more casualties you want to put on your enemy, not on yourself. So again, you and I have talked about this a lot. There is very low combat effectiveness for Russian troops. They're badly led. They are increasingly thrown into operations where they routinely lose 30, 40, 50% of their attacking force is killed. A recent battle in Kupiansk that you and I discussed in one of our later shows, 900 Russian troops were destroyed in 20 minutes. A battalion-sized attack wiped out in 20 minutes. Two things have to happen for that little dance to honor a very predictable Russian plan without adequate security, carried out in broad daylight on a predictable avenue of attack. Again, in broad daylight, 10 o'clock in the morning, a force separated before it reached its objective, not converging, diverging. And let's give Ukraine what it has due. Outnumbered on that particular case, at least 2 or 3 to 1, they inflicted almost 100% casualties on the attacking force in 20 minutes. And that can only be done when your ducks are all in a row. You have prepared your defenses, pre-planned artillery barrages, coordinated drone air support, have your forces dispersed so they all may fire converging and plunging fires on the enemies. None of that stuff happens by accident. There are no fortuitous circumstances of defense. You plan for it. And Ukraine is showing that they're doing it now.
And I think you probably have to give the Ukrainian defenders credit now for having prepared substantial defensive positions. A few weeks ago, when Ukraine was forced to withdraw from Avdiivka, they hadn't prepared new defensive positions to fall back to, and that did lead to a pretty dramatic Russian advance, which west of Avdiivka, which has come to a halt, by the way. So the Ukrainians are prepared. These repeated Russian assaults, as you say, Chuck, same time of day, same route across the battlefield, in a way that gives Ukraine plenty of practice on defense, anticipating what's going to come at them tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and the day after that.
You know, the last thing you ever want to be on the battlefield is predictable. You add predictability into your daily operations, and you can be sure your adversary is always going to be waiting for you. You keep attacking the same targets, using the same points of ingress, the same axes of attack. You're going to find that the terrain you are going to be transiting, that it's a kill box, right? That your adversary has taken the time to pre-plan artillery fires on that area. And we've seen recently, heretofore, the Russians have been out firing in terms of volume of fire. What the Russians lay out is usually 10, 15, some days 20 times what the Ukrainians are firing. But now, lately, in the last couple of weeks, we're finding that the Russian advantage or increase in volume of fire is only 2-1. Still highly unsatisfactory, but, you know, it's decreased almost by orders of magnitude. And that is telling as well, especially when Ukraine hits what they're aiming at, which the Russians don't always do.
In fact, Ukraine, I think, took out 51 artillery emplacements in a single day within the last few days. This also means that Ukraine is not being starved for shells on the front line. They've received the pledged artillery munitions from Czechia. They've also, I would have to surmise, received all the artillery ammo promised by the United States and other NATO allies. This is exactly what Ukraine needs right now as they face the last few defensive weeks before winter comes to Ukraine.
Right. So Ukraine has essentially been in a defensive posture for most of the summer, which they had to be. Those cards were dealt out last Christmas when Mike Johnson retarded the flow of arms to Ukraine. You know, an action that he still hasn't bothered to justify. For what reason did he do that? We said at the time, he literally added at least a year to this war by taking away Ukraine's ability to go on the offensive this summer. We will probably be frozen here within a matter of weeks in Ukraine. This is, after all, Ukraine with its legendary winters. So we'll have to see. You know, and I say Ukraine being on the defensive. I'm looking at a contact reports right now from Pokrovsk, and I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points of contact that are at their farthest. They are 5 kilometers east of the zero line. So Ukrainian forces, at least today in these contact reports, they have counterattacked Russian positions. And although the zero line has not been changed in this sector, the very least I could say is at least 5 units of Ukrainian assault elements are operating significantly in the Russian rear. which may also indicate, and other people have said this as well, the Russians may be culminating in their efforts to take Pokrovsk, which, by the way, is another burned out hulk of a city that has been utterly destroyed by Russian artillery. Again, have a little taste of Ruski Mir.
Rubble. At Ruski Mir, the Russian world is rubble. So Ukraine does appear to be picking some places to launch counterattacks. Also in Toretsk, Ukraine is running a pretty successful counterattack, again, through a rebelized city. And it's when you enter these destroyed cities, it creates a landscape where the fight is difficult and intense.
Yeah, so you will go from in many of these places in Ukraine and this city, again, there aren't really any suburbs. There is a three-dimensional urban space, and then the fields and the agricultural areas start. So Ukraine has almost turned the tides on the Russians in this particular battle space. It's normally the Russians who will go to great expense to form some small lodgment in an urban area. They will hold on to it tenaciously. They will replace their dead almost every day. They will keep the toehold, and their goal is to expand it. In this case, it's the Ukrainians who have infiltrated the three-dimensional battle space. And I use this turn of phrase a lot, but it's true. The fighting, instead of a battle of meters and kilometers, the battle sometimes is for centimeters. I say that the fighting is doorknob to doorknob, because you get into a building and you have to fight room to room in the building. Generally, you want to do that from the top down. That doesn't always get to happen, given that Ukraine doesn't really have an air force. They have very limited air assault assets. However, in the world of first-person video drones, you've got your vertical axis covered. So the fighting now will be room to room, floor to floor, building to building. And that's the way it's going to go. Russia is now sucked in to a really labor-intensive battle. It costs a lot of lives to fight house to house. So this is Ukraine kind of turning the tide on the Russians, baiting them into this fight. There's only a couple of ways into the city. Those ground lines of communication, because Russia will have to reinforce their troops, supply them. Those are going to create more targets for Ukraine because they can interdict the logistics. They can target troop concentrations as they come into the battle. So this is, like all city fights, it's an attritional fight that Ukraine has initiated here.
And when we move up to Kursk and take a look at the Ukrainian offensive up there, it's now surpassed 70 days that Ukraine has undertaken this incursion in Kursk. It did force the Russians to redeploy perhaps as many as 50,000 troops from Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, elsewhere on the front line. And it is in Kursk where North Korean troops coming to rescue Russia have already been seen in action or inaction. But this apparently is where the first 10,000, as many as 10,000 to 12,000 North Korean troops will be deployed. I find that interesting, that they are going first to help Russia reclaim its own territory.
Yeah, thus far, we don't have any confirmation of North Korean infantry in contact. We don't. We do know that North Korea has entered the fight. Their missileers have launched scores of ballistic missiles at Ukrainian cities. That's an irrefutable fact. We also know that about 18, maybe as many as 20 North Korean troops defected or went AWOL in Kursk. If they had been recaptured, I am certain that Russians would have crowed about it. So where they are right now, or in whose hands they have fallen, that remains to be seen. The estimate of North Korean troops entered into the Ukraine war is somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000. I actually think that number is around 10,000, just a hunch. We know that their missileers are operating in occupied Ukraine. That is a fact. As we pointed out before, those North Korean ballistic missiles, they didn't arrive with all their switches labeled in Russian. They didn't come with the manuals written in Russian. It was North Korean missileers who set the missile up, fueled it, and pushed the trigger. So they're in the fight. It remains to be seen. Also, how effective are North Korean troops going to be, right? They are an army frozen in amber, right? Their last significant ground combat was almost a century ago, 70 years ago. So how will they fight? I don't know. They're breathing the air of freedom. They're close to Ukraine. They're in a better position than they've ever been in their lives, right? They're not facing the DMZ or swimming in the Yellow Sea. They've got a chance. So go for it, guys.
Even the Ukrainians have recorded messages in their Come Home Alive program in Korean, telling the Korean soldiers now fighting in Kursk that Ukraine will take care of them. They'll provide them a warm place, good food, medical care. So come home alive, surrender. And I think it's a message that will be very appealing to a lot of these North Korean troops. The other thing that strikes me, Chuck, is how Russia will actually use these North Korean troops. Will they try to integrate them into a unified force of Russians and North Koreans, or will they segregate them and allow the North Koreans to undertake their own operations?
Wow. I would think, but again, Putin is not a person who looks ahead to consequences. He doesn't seem to think very well in the abstract. The best application of those troops, in my estimation, would be to have them as support troops, right? Carry out logistical tasks, possibly serve as engineers. And were I a Russian, I would try to look ahead to the cover of Time magazine showing a Korean with his hands over his head being captured by Ukrainian soldiers. And I would say, I don't want this to happen, right? I don't want Russia to be found guilty of internationalizing this war and using national troops who frankly have got a PR problem, right? This is the most repressive state on earth, where you can be shot to pieces with an anti-aircraft gun for listening to the wrong radio station. So there you go. If they're going to enter North Korean tactical formations into combat, I think they're going to have to be segregated. The language barrier is insoluble at a tactical level. So they will need advisors, liaison units, and they're going to have to be given relatively simple tactical evolutions to carry out. And the other thing is, if the goal is to put them into ground combat vis-a-vis Ukrainian forces, you've got to start with small operations and move forward. You wouldn't want to throw them into a large operation where you could have all of these problems, all these dominoes falling on you. But I'm speaking as a person who plans ahead. I'm speaking as a person who's looking at what could go wrong, single points of failure, and there are many.
Well, we know the Ukrainians have succeeded in digging in Kursk. They brought a number of engineers with the force that invaded Kursk. So the North Koreans are entering a pretty complex warscape, one that has already been fully prepared by Ukraine.
Well, looking back to the last major conflict fought by North Korea, their signature move was literally mass charges by thousands of troops. That isn't going to work on a 21st century battlefield. It simply is not. Artillery 70 years ago is not what it is now. An Excalibur artillery shell can land on your front porch or your back porch or go down your chimney. Just concentrating that number of people. If that's all you got, that's your one trick, mass, you have to concentrate that mass. And Ukraine has shown that its tactical intelligence is really pretty good. So let's say they were planning a big attack with North Korean troops. They'd have to be concentrated in a dense area, which makes them a very lucrative target. We just saw a Russian battalion-sized operation come to grief in 20 minutes. And those arguably were battle-hardened Russian troops, not troops that haven't been in combat in 70 years. So we'll have to see. Again, these are things I would be worried about if I were a Russian commander, but I think I worry about a lot more than they do. I think they worry about the same level as Alfred E. Newman, and isn't very much.
No, it doesn't. That's a very good metaphor. Alfred E. Newman. What me worry?
What worry exactly?
That's from the Mad Magazine days when Chuck and I were kids.
Yeah, when we were kids, and our parents would say, "Don't read that trash," and they'd take it away from us.
This is true. One other thing about the North Korean presence, invited by Russia to help them win back Russian territory. I guess actually Russia and North Korea have a security agreement that compels North Korea to assist Russia at this point. It is an escalation, one that everyone can see, even the de-escalation managers working in the Security Council in Washington, D.C. The chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Mike Turner, believes that the moment North Korean forces are confirmed to be in combat is the moment when the United States, in particular, should respond militarily. What are your thoughts about that, Chuck?
Well, that's the aspect of blowback we were just talking about. What net benefit is there for Russia to involve North Korea in this war? What are the likely consequences? What are some contingencies that could be expected? Like I said, the first moment a North Korean infantry combatant is captured in Ukraine. If one of those personnel is captured in Russia, maybe it slightly mitigates the blowback, but not really. Not really. We can expect sanctions to be more rigorously reinforced on Russia. We can expect North Korea, despite the U.S. sanctions, there are a number of nations that still deal with North Korea. That number will become less. Kim has thrown in his hand with Vladimir Putin. How dependent North Korea will now be on Russia. And, North Korea has a big shopping list. They want help in their space program, ICBMs. They want help with their sub-launch ballistic missiles. They want new airplanes, and they're flying 30, 40-year-old airplanes. They'll want all this stuff. But one of the principal things North Korea needs is food, because remarkably, socialism and agriculture don't really mix, and they haven't mixed for 100 years. So North Korea may find itself really in a bad place here, and we'll have to see. I mean, discontent in North Korea is almost unthinkable. But what's going to happen if thousands and tens of thousands of young men from Korea, and virtually every young man in Korea has to go into the armed forces? What's going to happen when they start coming home in bags from Putin's war? I don't know.
Well, you can guarantee that the North Korean regime will suppress that information. I think they have already, as a matter of fact, isolated the families of the North Korean soldiers sent to fight in Russia. That tells you something about the North Korean regime. And of course, there's a shadow ally here, China. North Korea wasn't invited to fight in Ukraine without China's pre-approval. I think that is something to take under consideration. And, the United States has now issued its very first sanctions on Chinese companies, identified as sending lethal aid to Russia. That is a pretty significant event, to have Chinese companies sanctioned as a result of their aiding Russia.
Yeah, and that, principally, well, China has become the principal supplier of dual-use technologies to Russia. And by this, I mean chips, thermal cameras, in many cases, complete drone systems. And that's the tip of the OSINT iceberg. It's long been suspected that there is genuine bona fide military aid coming from China as well. I think that's a pretty likely supposition. And but I'd say this: don't forget that the Soviet Union and the PRC had a shooting war, 1969 and 1970. China has plans for Asia, and they don't include Russia. It almost could be thought, look, and the Chinese we talk about the impulsivity of Vladimir Putin. President Xi is not an impulsive person. He thinks decades ahead. It might be that his plan is to let Russia enjoy their imperial adventure in Afghanistan. And, vicissitudes of the war come and go, but I have not changed my assessment that this war is already lost by Russia. They're on par to lose 35,000 men just this year. This will be the largest loss of life that Russia has suffered in a year of military service since World War II. They never lost 365,000 men in any year in Afghanistan. That's not what winning looks like.
Yeah, it's an order of magnitude that is just astounding. The other thing I surmise is that no one must appreciate Putin's need of North Korea's assistance more than Xi Jinping. He must be laughing in the background, quite possibly. But at the same time, if Russia, or when Russia loses this war, because of Xi Jinping's alliance with Putin, he stands to be embarrassed by this loss almost as much as Putin does.
Well, it could be. North Korea is a protege of the PRC, but they're not a favorite nephew. They do a lot of things that the PRC doesn't like. The nuclear tests among them, although they're frankly delighted that the DPRK has a nuclear weapons program. They thought testing these weapons in a number of underground tests was just jumping the shark a little bit. That routinely shooting intercontinental ballistics over the nation of Japan is just a little bit more provocative than it should be. So maybe it's in the PRC's interest to see North Korea brought down a peg or two, because I don't know what President for Life Kim thinks, but he's deploying an army whose tactics were frozen in amber. They're using equipment from the 1950s and 1960s, which isn't just old stuff. I mean, in terms of the military, those are relics. They're antiques. Their metallurgy doesn't work. Those weapons and their optics. Back in those days, weapons didn't come with optics, right? You didn't have a holographic sight for your rifle. You had a front sight and a rear aperture, right? That isn't how infantrymen fight anymore. There is no more mass. If you want to use mass on the battlefield, you have to conceal your movements. You have to have an iron dome over them, because if you put 1,000 troops together on a battlefield, they're going to get rocked by artillery. If you don't have counter battery radars, which I'm not sure North Korea has got a lot of them, and if they did, they probably weren't sent to Ukraine, you're going to have a problem. And you look at the day like Russia had yesterday, 55 artillery systems taken out in one day. That doesn't happen by accident. That's Ukrainian counter battery radar finding those locations and smothering them with artillery. So we'll have to see how these North Korean troops perform on the battlefield. If I had to guess now, I'd say they are intended, and they will wind up in ground combat units. I think that's something that has to be planned for. It's certainly probable at this point.
I would say it's probable, but I also agree with your comments earlier, Chuck, that the wisest way to use them would be in support roles and logistical roles, because I think the barriers to using them effectively on the ground, both the language barrier and quite possibly a tactical training barrier. I don't think that the North Koreans and the Russians fight alike. I just think it will be exceptionally difficult to integrate the North Koreans into the Russian forces. So it will be a very interesting aspect of this war to watch. It also speaks to Putin's need for manpower. He is facing a manpower shortage, not only on the battlefield, but at home in the Russian economy. There are so few men left in a number of places in Russia to take jobs. It is part of the crumbling of Russian society that we see, and we hope the crumbling of the Russian war machine not too far off in the future.
Right. Well, we talked a little bit about what was in this for North Korea. What's in this for Russia? Okay, what do they need? They need 3 million artillery shells a year, roughly half of their output of artillery per year in this war. That tells me they don't have them, right? 50% of their artillery shells are now going to be coming from North Korea. Okay. We hear intimations and confirmations that units at least as big as 10,000 people have been deployed to Russia for training. Look, the number 100,000 was thrown around in official communications. 3 divisions. Does Russia need the manpower? Yeah, they do. So you look at the needs that your adversary has, right? So this says a lot. And their utility on the battlefield, a combatant has to know how to shoot, move, and communicate. If you can't communicate, that affects the other 2 jobs you have, right? For how you're going to fight. So I don't know. This could be a major disaster for Russia. Here's where we stand, though, right now. There is no plan for Russia to win this war. Not now. With the resources they have at hand now, they're not capable of winning this war. If you add to that equation 100,000 North Korean troops, would that change the balance? Well, it might. It could. I frankly don't think it will, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see. Their numbers don't always swing. They don't always swing the equation. They are a factor in the calculus of battle, but they are not everything. As we just saw in Kupiansk, 400 Ukrainians take on 900 Russians, and they wipe them out in 20 minutes. That's what we call at the War College getting your ass kicked.
No question about that. But, as we started the show with a brief weather report, and it has been a warm autumn thus far in Ukraine. Chuck and I always look at the Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure and on ordinary Ukrainians just trying to live their lives by ones and twos, by tens and dozens more every single day. Russia is launching attacks on civilian infrastructure, on homes, schools, libraries, hospitals, and taking a terrible toll of Ukrainian life. The warm fall has given Ukraine something of a blessing, that it hasn't grown cold this fall in a way that would put pressure on the power supply that Ukraine is going to need for heat, electricity, lights throughout the winter. I think this will probably be the hardest winter Ukrainian civilians will have faced in the course of this war. Ukrainian cities are loud with the noise of generators, industrial-sized generators, all the way down to little generators. And not just the noise, but the smell of these generators. I think that through constant repair and also the dispersal of generating capacity into smaller and smaller grids, Ukraine will find a way to get through the winter. But this warm weather is a blessing to Ukraine right now.
Yeah, it is. But you and I know as New Englanders how quickly a mild autumn will change into full-blown winter. Tactically, in terms of environmental considerations, a rainy autumn would be great for Ukraine. It will complicate Russia's ability to maneuver, and that's what they have to do because they are on this mandated series of attacks. So, that in itself, when you know what the enemy is going to do, either because you've compelled him to do it, you've discovered what he's going to do it, whatever it is, if you know what the enemy's going to do, attack, retreat, go sideways, dig in, it's up to you to take advantage of that. because the enemy's intentions are always hard to discern. But in this case, you can count on if there is an adjacent Russian unit to you, it's going to attack. You can be ready for that. It takes 20 minutes to block out a planned artillery barrage. You give it the number Alpha, you call up the local battery and you say, execute fire mission 26 to Alpha. They'll start shoving the shells down there. And this is one of the reasons why Russian attacks are so costly. They are predictable. They utilize the same tactics again and again. Because their troops are so badly trained, they're forced to do everything in broad daylight. And I've mentioned before, I can almost count on one hand the number of times I operated in daylight. Yeah. And the only time we did that is when we were convinced they thought we only operated at night, so we'd come busting in during siesta time. So, yeah, it's a big problem with Russia. It's insoluble at this point. They're not at home with a whole draft class that they've decided that they're going to devote a full years of infantry training to this unit to build it up to a higher level of training. They're not doing that. They will never do that. You get drafted and 2 weeks later, you're on the zero line with all of the skills you learned playing Call of Duty on your Xbox. You are no kind of a soldier. And it shows every day in Russian operations.
While Chuck and I obviously concentrate on what is happening in Ukraine and also in Russia and among Russia's allies, we also from time to time take a look back. And this is something of a postscript in today's show. It is a look back to October 23, 1983 in Beirut. And that was the day of the terror bombing of the Marine barracks and a French barracks as well in Beirut. Chuck, you were in Beirut on that Sunday, weren't you?
I was. I was part of the multinational peacekeeping force that was deployed to Lebanon following the Israeli invasion. There were forces from Great Britain, Italy, France, and the United States were deployed, again, in a peacekeeping role. We were there to keep a number of combatants apart. It was the Israeli military, but they were versing the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was there in force. The PLO itself was rent by mutiny, so there were numerous factions in the PLO fighting against each other. There was Druze militia up in the hills. They had a place in the fight. Hezbollah didn't exist yet. It had a nascent organization called Amal, which actually was later one of the names of Osama bin Laden's wives. It, of course, was a tool of Iran, and it was the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and this nascent organization called Amal that carried out the bombing of the American peacekeepers. And also, within 30 seconds, the American bomb went off first. 30 seconds later, across town, a similar bomb went off outside the French Foreign Legion barracks. And that killed 50 French peacekeepers, wounded about 100 more, and 241 American peacekeepers perished in what was up to then the largest non-nuclear explosion in warfare. Virtually every Marine in that barracks was killed, with a handful of survivors. More than 90% of the people in that building were killed. Some were never found at all. But I was assigned as the executive officer of the SEAL platoon that was assigned to the multinational force. Prior to that, we conducted patrols through the city. tried to keep some of the combatants apart. As combat increased, and by the time the Israelis started to withdraw in late August, early September, a routine day in Beirut looked like the last 15 minutes of the movie Black Hawk Down. The entire city absolutely tore itself apart like something out of a Mad Max movie. It was absolutely post-apocalyptic. I have never seen such violence in my life. Never. Nothing has ever come close to what we saw there. It was where Osama bin Laden learned his techniques. He watched as a young man these bombings. He saw what sequential terrorist attacks could do, and he carried out a similar operation in Africa later, targeting U.S. embassies in widely spaced locations. So this event rolled through the 20th century and then the 21st century. And we've seen it come absolutely full circle now with what's going on in Beirut and Israel's sustained targeting of Hezbollah infrastructure in South Beirut. And again, it's more than a little ironic. These were exactly the neighborhoods that I patrolled as a young SEAL. The same streets, the same street corners, the areas around and to the south of the airport, right there. Nothing changes, Alan.
Well, I do remember how shocking the bombing of the Marine barracks were in 1983. So shocking that President Reagan demanded a military inquiry to determine what had happened. And I would also go so far as to say to learn some lessons. I wonder if you can take us back to that day, Chuck. Tell us about what that day was like for you, and then reflect about any lessons learned.
Well, it's a very complex story. I'll just start on the night before. The night before, it's Saturday night. Bombing took place on Sunday morning. Saturday night, Syrian artillery units in the hills undertook sustained harassing fire against the airport and against the position I was at, which was about 400 meters away from the bombed building. I led my SEAL platoon into the hills. We were trying to locate their artillery spotters if we could find one of their guns. We were out all night. We didn't have any joy. We also had rules of engagement so that even if I found an artillery position that was firing on Marine positions, I would call it in to get permission to act, and they would say, is he firing now? No, but he just fired 2 minutes ago. Well, call us back when he's firing. And that would repeat itself over and over again. So I got my guys back to our position and got into our bunker. Just about 5 minutes later, there was this earthquake that shook everything. The biggest explosion I'd ever heard. I first thought that a Scud missile might have been launched at the airport because I hadn't heard anything like that. I got out of my bunker and there was a 1,000-foot mushroom cloud rising over the barracks. I got into a observation tower we had. I looked and the building was gone. It just this thing in your brain. I don't know. For me, I'm an old guy. When I roll into Manhattan, I still look towards the south of the island and I don't see the Twin Towers anymore. You know, I see the new thing, but it isn't the same. This building was just gone. We carried out some tasking. We all reported to the wreckage and we dug with our bare hands, trying to get survivors out. During the rescue efforts, hundreds of riflemen fired at the wreckage. There were bullets spattering around us. One every 5, 10, 15 seconds, a bullet would hit. They were shooting all morning, all afternoon at the rescuers. Not a lot of. The more you dug, the less came out. There just weren't a lot of people there. There was an inquiry, of course, when our unit got back, which was about Christmas time. Very interesting thing transpired. I have since become friends with the commanding officer of the 2-4 Mal, the peacekeeping force, Colonel Tim Garrity. Of course, he was vastly superior to me, but we've since become friends. After he left the Marine Corps, he had a long and distinguished career at the CIA. When the congressional hearings were held, a lieutenant general named Pfarrer, no relation to me, was head of the National Security Agency. It turns out that this general, and if you're still alive, General, I don't think you are, but please, your relatives, please call me. We'll discuss what libel is. He lied in his congressional testimony. He said that they had no idea this attack was going to be carried out, when in fact the National Security Agency had intercepted every single transmission that went from Iran to Damascus, to the makers of the bombs, to the places they rehearsed, to their targets. They had everything, but they didn't translate it. So this bombing happened because the NSA, it's a dereliction of duty. But to compound this general lied in his congressional testimony. Colonel Garrity, his career was over. He left the Marine Corps honorably, but this was a gentleman who might have been commandant of the Marine Corps and perhaps chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was a brilliant officer whose men loved him as I did. He was an exceptional officer. But it sounds odd, but the Beirut fiasco had a lot to do with me leaving the service later. To see what happened and how the government chose to spin the information and about what happened in the incident itself. But I would say this. Could Colonel Garrity have done more to prevent the bombing? Well, let's just look at it this way. I had a drink with him, once we became friends while we were both working in Washington. And I said, I have always wondered, my colleague and I wanted to do some demolition work to dig trenches in the below trenches in the parking lot that the truck came through. And he looked at me and he said, "You know how big the bomb was?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "What would have happened if they simply parked it on the street?" And our building, the peacekeeping building, was right on the airport access road. He said, "Could we have blocked off the airport road? No. What if they had parked the bomb on the highway outside the barracks? What would have happened?" I would have said the building would have been destroyed. Right. That bomb was so big that it didn't matter if it got near the building. It could simply go to a place that we couldn't have done anything about. The French peacekeepers, 50 were killed, hundreds were wounded, and the bomb didn't even go off next to the building. It went off in the neighborhood, and it still did that damage. So who won? Well, because of that terrorist operation, the multinational force was withdrawn from Beirut, and the civil war continued for almost a decade. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese dead. It missed its chance. And to this day, I look at Lebanon and my heart breaks. A beautiful country with industrious people who, the Lebanese diaspora around the world, they are entrepreneurs, business owners, hardworking people who just deserve a better set of neighbors than Hezbollah. So it was a complex It was a complex thing. Up and down, right and wrong, it's pretty hard to dig it all out, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is hard to dig out the facts and make judgments based on facts. It's something that takes decades sometimes, and this is an event that has been looked at decades later, and it is an event worth remembering. So I want to thank you, Chuck, for taking us back to Beirut on October 23, 1983, a Sunday morning when you were there. We're going to draw this episode of Indications and Warnings to a close. And again, I want to give Chuck my special thanks for talking about his experience in Beirut so many years ago. We'll be back with another episode of Indications and Warnings. For you to know when it will be broadcast, you need to subscribe to the Information Warfare Initiative. That way you will get notified when Chuck and I come back to report again, primarily about events in Ukraine, and to bring you additional maps from the Zero Line to give you an analysis of what's happening. You can be sure that Chuck and I are keeping our eyes peeled for the very first combat, or if not combat, the very first assignments for the North Korean troops now helping Russia conduct its genocidal war against Ukraine. So do follow us, like us, share Indications and Warnings. Chuck and I will be back time and time again as long as this war goes on.
Yep, we are going to cover it, folks, and then we're going to cover Reconstruction. So please do join us, help us with that algorithm. Just clicking a like helps us, and get in the information warfare fight with us. We are all the last bastion in this information warfare struggle. And Alan, thank you for another great show, and I'll be talking to you in a day or so.
Thank you, Chuck. And everyone knows what side we're on. Slava Ukraini.
Herojam Slava.